So the first question comes from Adam, and this is actually just a really good question. And he's asking about those changes during puberty and how they're associated with these increased negative emotions. So he's asking about the internal and external factors that contribute to these negative emotions, and then what kind of solutions can we attempt to minimize these negative emotions. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about sort of the external factors involved with negative emotion, and that is society. So a lot of the mood swings and this kind of turmoil and issues that we see a lot of times that adolescents will express, a lot of it comes from societal expectations. We don't see the same storm and stress that we see in all cultures. It's not across the board. So if the culture is expecting, or society is expecting adolescents to act out and to be moody and to, be, kind of, that teenage period where they're kind of jerks. If the society expects that, and we see that in the media, we see that in movies, we see it in TV shows, then the teenagers are going to act that way because that's what they feel like they're expected to do. If there's a culture where we see teenagers being more affiliated with their family, and a particular neighborhood or culture expects that their teens are good kids who help out, then that's how they're going to usually act. So societal expectations is a huge external factor that really predicts how a teenager might act given, even the changes that happen internally biologically during puberty. And so that's a huge factor that a lot of people don't really consider. But we do find that does impact how an adolescent is going to portray some of those characteristics. And also, open communication and the idea of family and support, all of those things are going to impact how a teenager feels and how they're able to respond to those biological changes that happen in their body. If, it's very accepted and parents are very understanding and know that the period of adolescence is all about independence and finding autonomy. And if they're given that, freedom, but, with still, rules and love and certain expectations to act a certain way. If they're given that and given those boundaries, but yet still, okay, you have autonomy, then we find that they react really, really well to that, So, these are the kinds of things that we can do externally to help an adolescent during this, this process. Number one is being supportive. Number two is providing autonomy and trust, not sneaking and looking at their phone and violating boundaries and trust like that. And then also as a society, we can do a whole lot better about our expectations for how teenagers should act. Don't have these TV shows that have these rebellious teens who are having sex and drinking and taking drugs, because that's going to be the expectation that our teenagers have. That's what society expects. That's how they expect I should act. That's how I'm going to act. So that's kind of the external side of things. Now, the internal side of things, of course, is hormones, right? So the short answer for girls is, of course, estrogen and progesterone. For boys, it's testosterone. And so changes in these kinds of hormones are going to, for some, produce emotional changes, mood swings and some negative emotion, things like that. But again, it's about how they're processing it and the expectation, and also their knowledge, the education behind it. If we talk to adolescents and explain, hey, these are the changes that happen in your body, this is how you can expect. It's okay to be depressed sometimes. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be frustrated and to be angry, and teach the adolescent how to deal with that, how to cope with that. All you're doing is setting them up for success later on, because we need a toolkit. Everybody needs a toolkit, and everybody's toolkit's going to be different. How do you deal with stress? How do you deal with negative emotion? How do you deal with sadness, with anger, with failure? And if you can help an adolescent with their toolkit, and they can use those tools and resources as they're going through this process, and that's going to help them deal a whole lot better. Now, what you use in adolescent may not work as you become an adult, or, you know, a young adult, or going through college, and then, you know, enter into, you know, full adulthood, whatever that is. You know, as that process continues, then your toolkit needs to adapt, and it needs to be able to, shift depending on what the new challenge is. So even though we see these hormonal changes, and we do know that that does impact some people emotionally more so than others, realize that a lot of this going on, any changes that you see in hormone level, it does not happen in a vacuum. Same thing when you look at depression, when you look at, you know, addiction, when you look at any kind of changes in drug use, when you change the way that the brain works, whether it's an internal process where we see puberty triggering this cascade of hormone changes, or it's an external force like maybe drugs or something, you're going to see that it's not going to impact one system. So like, let's talk about the dopamine neurotransmitter pathway. There are several different dopamine pathways, and there are several different serotonin pathways. So serotonin is most associated with depression. So we see people who don't have enough serotonin tend to experience depression, which is why we give a medication called an SSRI, or a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And what it does is it stops the brain from, it blocks the serotonin from kind of going and being wasted, and it gets sucked back up into the neuron. And so it increases the amount of serotonin in that particular pathway. Well, if you impact that serotonin pathway, then you're going to impact other serotonin pathways. And serotonin and dopamine have a system, so you're going to impact dopamine. Think of it like a ripple in a pool, right? You drop a pebble, and that ripple is going to, you know, go not to just one localized area, but it's going to move outward. And that's kind of how hormones work. Neurotransmitters work, is that you have impact one, and it could cascade and trigger other changes that happen. So, you know, while a person might experience an increase or decrease in estrogen, that might impact serotonin, which might, you know, lead to feelings of depression. And so all of these things, you know, are so interrelated, that it's important to realize that, you know, just because we're talking about these main hormones during puberty, it does impact other neurotransmitters. It does impact other chemicals in the brain. And we're going to see that, that effect in behavior, and we're going to see it in emotion and mood regulation. So hopefully that answers your question. Best way to, you know, to really to combat this is education and support for adolescents. Okay. Marcus asked a question about teenage pregnancy. And so he said, when it comes to teenage pregnancy, he asked, how does pregnancy affect the health of girls of that age? And then why are parents so reluctant when putting these adolescents in sex education? Now, these are great questions. And we had some really fantastic answers by other students. So I really suggest that you go onto Moodle and you check this question out in the answers, because there were some really, really good comments on this. And I think that was, you know, it's always great when you can see other students answering the question, because there's a lot of information there that I think that you guys should check out. So let me do my take on it. So first of all, the health impact. Now, most of the information that we have about the impact of health is actually about really young adolescents, like younger than 15. You know, 16 to 18, you know, a lot of these impacts are, you know, the body's mature. You know, we're not seeing as much of an impact as we're seeing with a lot younger girls. You know, and a lot of the health impacts that we see are during pregnancy. So we're seeing, for example, low birth weight in premature babies. We're seeing that the girl might develop anemia during pregnancy and have blood pressure issues during pregnancy. For example, preeclampsia, high blood pressure, and that resolves once the baby is born. We do also see a higher rate of infant mortality. Now, it's hard to say what exactly is going on here. Is it because the body isn't fully, quote unquote, mature? It's mature enough to get pregnant, to conceive, but is it mature enough to carry a baby full term? We have to think about maturity level, emotional maturity level, psychological maturity level of the girl. And think about all the important things that you need to do during pregnancy. Take prenatal vitamins, make sure you eat really well, make sure you exercise, make sure your mental health is in a good place, that you have reduced stress, things like that. And if you think about a very young girl being pregnant, trying to finish school or go to high school, and dealing with societal stigma of teenage pregnancy, there's a lot going on there. And so we might actually see more of the issues coming from the societal pressure and the psychological and emotional health being impacted during teenage pregnancy. And that is not necessarily before 15, that is teenage pregnancy. So, a lot of the concerns should be with how do we help teenage girls who become pregnant, make sure they finish school, make sure they have a support system, and it could be that they are experiencing a lot of emotional and psychological impact from that. So that's kind of the health side of things. Now, when it comes to parents being reluctant to put their adolescent into sex education, so this is loaded. Wow, there's a lot here. I could probably spend an entire day talking about this, but let's just get down to the basics, okay? So there was a recent study, I believe it was published in 2010 or 2011, and it was in the UK. So it's a little bit different in terms of culture, but pretty much very, very similar. What we find is that 41% of the parents that were asked, which I believe it was almost 2,000 parents, I think it was something like 1,700 parents were asked, 41% of them actually said that they thought it was inappropriate to teach sex ed in schools. Their reasoning was mostly that they thought it was inappropriate. They were embarrassed by it, that they thought that it should fall. A lot of them said that the duty should fall onto the parents. Okay. So that's a lot of their reasoning, was it's not a topic that should be taught in schools. Almost half, so about 48% of the parents said that if you were to teach sex ed in schools, it should definitely be kids 13 and older. Many of the parents objected against teaching it at a younger age and were afraid of how that was going to be perceived in terms of what was being taught and dealing with, I guess, the education for younger kids. Now, why is it that parents tend to not like sex ed in schools or teaching their kids sex ed? So there's a lot of things here. There was an answer to this question that really hit a big point, and that's about religion. And religion is a big factor here. Staying pure and having an abstinence only mindset, that does not work as a sex ed tool, technique, way to teach it. Abstinence only doesn't work. So many programs have failed that have tried to do promise rings and promise statements and signing that you won't have sex until you get married. There's so many of those programs out there, and all of them have been very unsuccessful. In areas where religion is a really where we tend to see more conservative, very religious parents, we see a lot of objection to sex ed, and again, part of it is a miseducation, misinformation. So parents may be misinformed about what sex ed is about and what it teaches. Parents themselves a lot of times are not super educated on sex. You would be shocked, or maybe not, to see some of the kinds of things that even college students believe, in terms of myths, in terms of what you can and can't do to get pregnant. Some say, oh, well, they definitely can't get pregnant while you're on your period. That's impossible. And it is very possible. Just not understanding the biology of men and women, not understanding the sex organs and not understanding how sex works, in terms of biology. A lot of people are misinformed. I would probably say that the majority of people are probably misinformed, versus those who are educated on it. Parents also are very embarrassed to talk about it and very embarrassed to talk to their kids about it. And they're embarrassed for their kids to learn about it. And so that's a major factor. Parents may go, that's my little girl, that's my little boy, I don't want them to learn about it. They're still a kid. Once you teach about sex, then suddenly it flips a switch and you don't have a baby anymore. And so a lot of people have that mindset. It's like, okay, once they learn about sex, they're no longer innocent. And that's not the case. I mean, there have been so many successful programs teaching sex education or your body as young as 7 years old, especially in other countries. And they've had some amazing results. A lot of parents believe that teaching sex will lead to promiscuity, and it does not. Study after study after study show that kids who are taught proper sex ed actually engage in a lot fewer risky behaviors than those who are misinformed or those who are not taught sex ed. And we find that kids will learn about it. Kids will learn about it, whether they Google it, whether their friends tell them about it. Can you imagine a 14-year-old learning about sex from another 14-year-old? It happens all the time, and it's scary because 14-year-olds don't really know a whole lot, a lot of them, about sex. And so what they learn is from movies and from the internet and from Googling around terms. And that a lot of times can be really do a lot of damage, especially when it comes to porn and a lot of the issues with consent and understanding what no means and understanding boundaries. And so, a child or an adolescent who's given proper education, and of course geared toward their age. I'm not saying take a 7-year-old and explain the whole thing to them, in a gruesome way or in a very vivid way. You do things that's age appropriate, and you build on that foundation. Starting with teaching young children what their body parts are called. Like, saying penis is not a derogatory or offensive term. Understanding the difference between a vulva and a vagina, which most people actually call of anything that's related to the female anatomy. Everything is a vagina. The vagina is the birth canal. It's the not the outside of the sex organ. And so, the word vulva feels very vulgar because it's very close to that word. And so a lot of people just don't like using that proper terms. But if you teach children the right terms, that just builds them to a future of understanding and being educated and being informed. And so, a lot of the, so those are a few of the reasons, besides things like, parents being worried about their, kids losing their innocence or being more likely to engage in sexual behavior or risky behaviors. All of those things are factors on the table. So I think it's really important to not fall into this, sex ed is the devil, although I do say that it's important that kids are taught about sex education, not only in school, but at home. I do think that parents and teachers share responsibility, and I don't think that parents should rely on school systems to teach sex ed. And I don't think that schools should rely on, on parents to teach sex ed. I think it should be an open thing. And it's scary and embarrassing and weird, but, we have to get over that. So hopefully that answers your question on that. And then the final question is from Mackenzie, and she says that she hopes to one day teach middle school, maybe 7th or 8th grade. And then she asks about a specific scenario where she might have a boy, although girls can certainly do this as well, that they might have aggressive sexual behavior or show aggression, power, masculinity, anger at females, maybe wanting to hurt people. Is there anything that she can do? Is there, and obviously she's saying she doesn't want to be a parent to the child, but from a psychological perspective, what's the best course of action to take? And honestly, I would say and this is very possible. I mean, this does happen pretty frequently where we see a case of sexual aggression or aggression in general, boys or girls. It is not limited to boys. My first concern would be if the child seems to be overly educated on some things, or might know a little bit more than they should. Either they could be being abused, or they're exposed to a lot of things that maybe they shouldn't. So, you might want to dig around, ask a few questions, speak to the guidance counselor, just to make sure that the child is safe. That would be my absolute first thing. So see what you can do about getting the child help. So if you've kind of determined that the child is relatively safe, that there's no, home issue, the child's not being abused, this might just be the way the kid is acting out. The first thing I would suggest, besides making sure that they're safe, is see what you can do about getting the child help. So a lot of times we want to see if there's a diagnosis there. So for example, oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, is a disorder that's commonly diagnosed for children who have a lot of aggressive tendencies, who seem to fight you, be very aggressive, and there's a whole criteria, and you would use the DSM-5 for diagnosis, and you'd of course go to a psychologist or psychiatrist for that diagnosis. But seeing if that child needs to be referred. So going to the guidance counselor, or whoever, if the school has a child psychologist sort of on call, or who comes by, seeing what you can do in terms of getting professional help for the child. That's the first thing I would do in that regard. And then you can develop an IEP, or an individualized education plan, to help the child in their school career. So if they need a special place to go to calm down, if they need a special attention, if they need an assistant, whatever they might need that can help them with that process of dealing with the issues that they're experiencing. So a lot of times what we might see is that the child is, and I have this as one of my last points, why do children tend to act out at school? And I want to kind of fit this in here. And that is, a lot of times children don't feel safe at home. And so their safe space is school. And so they might act out at school. So they might be not necessarily abused, but they might not have the best home life. And so, if you see a child acting out at school, it might just be that they're just acting their worst because they feel very safe around you. And so again, having a plan and making sure that the child is cared for properly across all the teachers and across the school, and having the services that the child needs available, and having those resources available to the parents. Now, some of this can actually just very much be across any child or any adolescent. And number one is pick your battles. You can argue over everything, and you can have certain expectations and say you have to act this way and you have to do this. And if you choose to battle at every point, you're going to have issues. And you've got to learn to sometimes let some things go, and understand when are things, because maybe the child is sleep deprived, maybe they're irritable, maybe they're hungry, what's going on. And sometimes you do have to pick those battles. You should definitely be open and trusting. You want that child to see you as an ally and an advocate for them. You stand up for them. You are supportive of them. And, that's really, that idea of being trusting for some kids is a lifesaver. Also consistency. Consistency in the classroom is key. Having an IEP will help with consistency across all teachers, all classes, and throughout their grades, like their grade levels. And so consistency in terms of how you treat them, consistency in the rewards and punishments, all very important. Consistency in schedule. All very important especially for a child who has maybe emotional issues. If the child, especially if the child does have ODD or has aggressive tendencies, a lot of times having a place for that child to calm down and be able to do things like mindfulness, meditation, counting can really help them calm down quickly. You can have a calming space, like a calming corner, or a reset place or something like that, where it's like, dimly lit, a comfy chair, a bean bag, some pillows, maybe a book, something, a quiet that they can, a quiet place that they can go to calm themselves. And this is not just ODD. This is several other, and this is really any kid who's upset. You can have them, go to this kind of space. Not like they're sitting in the corner and they're in timeout, but it's just, they're able to kind of gather themselves and reset. And sometimes I want to have that. I like to have a calming corner for myself. Also, positive reinforcement and having a reward system. So I'm not sure if we've gone through this yet. I want to say that we've gone through conditioning and learning, but we do have a class. We have a learning class that's separate from this, and you learn about classical and operant conditioning. But operant conditioning, we learn about through like B.F. Skinner, and he used pigeons and rats and all that sorts of things, animals, starting with Pavlov's dog. All these same principles are used in cases where we have children who are, misbehaving, or we want a certain kind of behavior. So if you want a certain kind of behavior to be repeated, you're going to reward that behavior. You're going to reinforce it. And if you want the behavior to stop, of course, depending on the situation, you're going to use punishment. And a lot of people get reinforcement and punishment confused, but I do have a lecture on that, or at least a slideshow that talks about the difference between positive, negative, reinforcement, and punishment. But really those same principles are used for children to try to get kids to repeat good behaviors and to stop bad behaviors, and being consistent with that, consistent with the reward system, consistent with how you want them to act and the expectations can really help with that kind of a situation. And hopefully throughout all of this, you'll be working with the guidance counselor, you'll be working maybe with a psychologist, with the parents, with other teachers, trying to maintain this consistency both at home and in the classroom. And I would definitely see aggressive sexual behavior and aggressiveness toward girls or women as a huge red flag. And I would hope that some of these tools that I've talked about here are something that you can use to, help the child kind of deal with that, and help decrease some of those really alarming behaviors. And hopefully, being able to have someone like a child psychologist who's able to help with that side of things, right? So you wouldn't be qualified to counsel a child if you are a teacher, unless you had like a counseling degree or a master's in counseling, something like that. So I would leave that sort of thing to the child psychologist, unless there's something that child psychologist can tell you, hey, this is what I suggest that you do in the classroom, which would be really, really helpful. So being able to know somebody who can help you in that regard can really help your kids out. So hopefully I answered your question. If there's anything that you have that I didn't answer, you can send me an email and I'm happy to respond to that. And so if I don't have any more questions, or if everybody's good, then I'll go ahead and end today's session. And we will see you next week. Make sure that if you're not on the Remind app, that you go ahead. I send an email out with a link. Go ahead and get on that, because I send announcements and reminders pretty regularly. And so you can get that sent straight to your phone. And so that way you can get those reminders on the things that you have due. So make sure you do that. And I will see you guys next week. And email me if you have any problems or questions. All right. See you guys later.